The sand wasn't always sand. That's the first thing they don't tell you in school. The thing that gets buried under all the marble statues and epic movie scores and Russell Crowe swinging a sword like he's auditioning for a superhero flick. The floor of the Colosseum, that massive, gorgeous monument to human engineering that tourists photograph 1,000,000 times a day, was soaked so deep in blood over the centuries that historians believe the wooden planks had to be replaced constantly, not because they rotted from rain or weather, but because they were literally saturated with the biological leftovers of dying men. And before you picture some noble warrior going out in a blaze of glory with a crowd cheering his name, understand that the reality was a whole lot messier, a whole lot more complicated, and honestly way more fascinating than anything Hollywood ever sold you. Because here's the hook nobody throws at you up front: most gladiators didn't want to die. And the crowd, most of the time, didn't want them to die either. The whole thing was basically the WWE of the ancient world, which sounds like a joke until you dig into the actual archaeology and realize how close that comparison really is. So strap in, because the real story of Roman gladiators is darker, stranger, and more human than you ever imagined, and once you know it, you can't unknow it. The Romans built a world-class entertainment industry on the backs of enslaved people, prisoners of war, and desperate volunteers, and they were disturbingly good at it. Like, frighteningly, culturally sophisticated about it in ways that mirror modern sports entertainment so closely it should make every football fan a little uncomfortable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where it actually started, because the origin of gladiatorial combat is not what most people think, and it sets the tone for everything that came after. The earliest gladiatorial contests didn't happen in arenas. They didn't happen for the entertainment of emperors or cheering crowds. They happened at funerals. Specifically, they were part of a ritual called the munus, which was an obligatory offering made to honor the dead. The Etruscans, who heavily influenced early Roman culture, believed that when a powerful man died, his spirit required blood to sustain it in the afterlife. Not animal blood, human blood. Spilled in combat. The idea was that two warriors fighting to the death beside a grave would release enough spiritual energy to nourish the deceased on his journey. The Romans picked this up and ran with it, the way Romans ran with everything they took. Someone else's idea, scaled it up, bureaucratized it, added infrastructure, and turned it into a pillar of their civilization. By the time the Republic was in full swing, these funeral games had evolved into public spectacles tied to political ambition, with wealthy men sponsoring increasingly elaborate contests to honor their dead relatives, not coincidentally, to make the Roman public love them. Julius Caesar famously sponsored games featuring over 300 pairs of gladiators to honor his father, a spectacle so enormous it scandalized the Senate, who then tried to pass laws limiting how many fighters any one person could field because they were genuinely afraid of what a man with a private army of trained killers could do to the political order. They were right to be scared, by the way. But here's where the dark truth starts layering in: the men who fought in these contests weren't just random slaves tossed into a pit and told to kill each other. The training system that developed around gladiatorial combat was one of the most sophisticated athletic institutions in the ancient world. The ludus, or gladiatorial school, was a serious place. These weren't dungeons. Archaeological evidence, particularly from the gladiatorial barracks discovered at Pompeii and from skeletal remains analyzed in Ephesus, paints a picture of fighters who received high-quality food, dedicated medical care, professional athletic training, and something that functions very much like a modern sports contract. The diet alone is remarkable. Gladiators were fed a high-carbohydrate regimen heavy in barley and legumes that sports scientists have recently analyzed and determined was specifically designed to build a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over their muscles. Not because Romans didn't know about lean muscle, because that fat layer acted like armor. A cut-through fat bleeds dramatically and looks spectacular to a crowd without necessarily hitting anything vital. Gladiators were engineered to bleed without dying, which tells you everything you need to know about what the business model actually was. The skeletons found in Ephesus back this up in brutal detail. Forensic analysis shows that most gladiatorial remains have healed injuries, fractures that were set properly, wounds that were sutured with real medical skill. The gladiators of ancient Rome had access to better healthcare than most free Roman citizens. They were valuable property, and valuable property gets maintained. Training a gladiator from scratch took years and cost enormous amounts of money, so killing them off wastefully made zero economic sense. This is the part that really flips the script on everything you think. You know, death in the arena was actually relatively rare compared to the popular image. Scholars like Kathleen Coleman and Michael Carter have analyzed the epigraphic and literary evidence and found that the death rate in Munera, the gladiatorial games, was somewhere around 1 in 10 contests, and even that number dropped significantly during certain periods when well-trained fighters were particularly expensive and hard to replace. The thumbs up, thumbs down thing that everyone knows from the movies? Completely misunderstood. The gesture that determined a fallen gladiator's fate wasn't thumbs up for life and thumbs down for death. The actual scholarship suggests the death signal involved a turned or extended thumb, possibly mimicking a sword thrust, while the mercy signal was a closed fist or hidden thumb. And the person making that call wasn't always the emperor sitting in his fancy box. Often it was the editor, the sponsor of the games, responding to the crowd's reaction, which itself was responding to how well the losing fighter had performed. A man who went down fighting hard, who showed courage and skill even in defeat, could walk out of that arena alive and come back to fight another day. A man who cowered or gave up without a real fight might get the death signal regardless of his position on the sand. There's something almost perversely meritocratic about it that the Romans would have completely recognized and probably been proud of. Now, here's where it gets genuinely complicated, because gladiators occupied one of the strangest social positions in Roman society. Legally, most were infames, a Latin term meaning people without legal standing or social honor, a category that also included actors, prostitutes, and certain types of criminals. If you were a gladiator, you couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, couldn't give testimony in court. You were, in the eyes of Roman law, essentially invisible as a citizen. And yet, the graffiti on the walls of Pompeii, that incredible, unfiltered archive of what actual Romans actually thought rather than what educated elites wrote down for posterity, is absolutely full of gladiators. Their names appear scratched into stone with the kind of breathless admiration you'd find on a teenage girl's notebook in 1995 with a boy band member's name on it. Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh, reads one inscription. Crescens the net fighter holds the hearts of the girls at night, reads another. These men were celebrities. They were sex symbols. Women of high social standing, including, according to the satirist Juvenal, senators' wives, allegedly sought them out. The philosopher Seneca complained bitterly about the corrupting influence of the arena on Roman morals. The fact that multiple sources felt the need to complain about it tells you it was a real and ongoing phenomenon, not a one-time scandal. The tension between official Roman disgust at the gladiators' lowly status and the genuine popular adoration these men received is one of the most revealing contradictions in Roman culture. It's the same tension you see in modern society around athletes, rappers, or anyone who rises to fame through a path that polite society finds distasteful but can't look away from. Some gladiators leaned into the celebrity hard. There's evidence of gladiators who became so popular they could negotiate their contracts, demand better living conditions, and essentially operate as something closer to professional athletes than enslaved fighters. Some were free men who had voluntarily signed up the auctorati, who gave up their legal rights in exchange for a salary, food, housing, and the intoxicating pull of the arena's spotlight. We know this because Roman law had to create specific provisions for dealing with freeborn men who chose this path, which tells you it happened often enough to require regulation. The voluntaries complicate the simple slavery narrative considerably. Why would a free man choose this? Sometimes it was pure desperation, debt, poverty, no other options. But sometimes it was genuinely the pull of what the arena offered. Fame, physical excellence pushed to its absolute limit, a kind of belonging to a brotherhood of fighters that Roman society's rigid class structure didn't offer anywhere else. The gladiatorial barracks were, by the account of their skeletal remains and their architectural layouts, places of intense communal living. These men trained together, ate together, were patched up by the same doctors, and in many documented cases, died together and were buried together in dedicated cemeteries with proper grave markers, a dignity denied to many enslaved people in the ancient world. The cemetery at Ephesus, excavated by Austrian archaeologists in the early 2000s, contained grave markers with gladiatorial iconography and inscriptions that show these men were mourned, remembered, and honored by their fellow fighters. One tombstone was erected by a man's brother-in-arms, another by what appears to be a wife. These were not anonymous bodies discarded after use. They were people with relationships, identities, and communities that cared about them even within the brutal structure of the system that consumed them. None of this makes the system okay. That needs to be said clearly, because the details are so interesting, it's easy to get lost in them and forget the fundamental violence underneath everything. The gladiatorial system was built on coercion. Prisoners of war had no choice. Condemned criminals had no choice. Enslaved people had no choice. The men who volunteered did so within a social and economic context so constrained that calling it a free choice is philosophically complicated at best. The crowd that roared for their favorites was also the crowd that sometimes demanded blood and got it. Men did die on that sand horribly, publicly, as entertainment for tens of thousands of people who went home afterward and had dinner. The Roman capacity to hold genuine admiration for a man's skill and courage alongside a casual willingness to watch him be killed is not a paradox that resolves neatly. It's a feature of a civilization that was simultaneously capable of breathtaking intellectual achievement and breathtaking cruelty, often in the same afternoon. The emperors understood the arena's power completely and wielded it without hesitation. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses, wasn't just a cynical slogan Juvenal threw out as criticism, it was a genuine governing strategy. Keep the population fed and entertained, and they won't ask too many questions about who's running things or how. The Colosseum, which could hold between 50 and 80,000 spectators, was free to enter for Roman citizens. The games were free. The emperor paid for them out of his own treasury, or rather out of the treasury he controlled, which amounted to the same thing. Domitian famously held games by torchlight that went on through the night. Trajan celebrated his Dacian victories with games lasting 123 days involving 10,000 gladiators. The scale of it is almost incomprehensible until you think about what it meant politically. This was a ruler literally purchasing the loyalty and attention of his entire city, manufacturing collective joy and collective catharsis on an industrial scale. The last recorded gladiatorial games in Rome are generally dated to around 404 CE, when a Christian monk named Telemachus supposedly jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the crowd, after which Emperor Honorius banned the games entirely. The story might be legendary rather than strictly historical, but the date holds roughly. Gladiatorial combat faded as the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Christianity reshaped what Roman society considered acceptable public spectacle. The infrastructure remained. The Colosseum stood, but the thing it was built for slowly became unthinkable, then illegal, then forgotten except as a romantic ruin that people would spend the next 15 centuries painting and photographing and writing poems about without fully reckoning with what actually happened there. What actually happened there was human beings at the absolute peak of their physical conditioning, carrying everything they had ever learned about survival and combat and reading another person's intentions in a fraction of a second, stepping out onto a floor built over a labyrinth of tunnels from which animals and men and elaborate stage machinery could be lifted hydraulically into sudden daylight, in front of a crowd that knew their names, had bet money on them, had written their names on walls, and was also fully prepared to watch them die. It was the most human thing imaginable and the least human thing imaginable happening in the same place at the same time. And that tension between the crowd's genuine love for these men and its genuine capacity to demand their deaths is the dark truth that nobody tells you, because it doesn't resolve. It just sits there, in the archaeology and the graffiti and the healed bones and the grave markers, asking you something uncomfortable about what people are capable of when entertainment and power and life and death all end up in the same arena.